Our Mutual Friend, written in 1864–1865, is the last novel completed by Charles Dickens and is one of his most sophisticated works, combining savage satire with social analysis. It centers on, in the words of critic J. Hillis Miller, quoting the book's character Bella Wilfer, money, 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 and what money can make of life. Most reviewers in the 1860s continued to praise Dickens' skill as a writer in general, but did not review this novel in detail. Some found the plot both too complex and not well laid out. The Times of London found the first few chapters did not draw the reader into the characters. In the 20th century, however, reviewers began to find much to approve in the later novels of Dickens, including Our Mutual Friend. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, some reviewers suggested that Dickens was, in fact, experimenting with structure, and that the characters considered somewhat flat and not recognized by the contemporary reviewers were meant rather to be true representations of the Victorian working class and the key to understanding the structure of the society depicted by Dickens in the novel. Major characters. Edit. John Harmon is heir to the Harmon estate, under the condition that he marry Bella Wilfer. He is presumed dead throughout most of the novel, though he is living under the name John Rokesmith, and working as a secretary for the Boffins in an attempt to better get to know Bella, the Boffins, and people's general reaction to John Harmon's death. Harmon also uses the alias Julius Handford upon first returning to London. Harmon's death and subsequent resurrection as Rokesmith Handford is consistent with Dickens' recurring theme in the novel of rebirth from the water. His upward social mobility through his own efforts is presented as favorable, in contrast with Headstone, Hexam, and the Lamleys. 9. Bella Wilfer is a beautiful girl born into poverty, who learns upon the death of old Mr. Harmon that she is the intended wife for his son, a condition of his inheritance. When her intended husband, John Harmon, is reported to have been killed, she is left without future prospects. She learns of the trouble money can bring when taken in by the newly rich Boffins. Bella rejects Rokesmith's proposal at first but later accepts it. Initially described as a mercenary young woman, who describes herself upon meeting Lizzie Hexam as having no more character than a canary bird, Bella undergoes a significant moral change in the novel. Although originally completely preoccupied with money, her complexity is eventually displayed in her ability to defy the societal pressures to achieve happiness unrelated to wealth. She is praised for her vivacity and lifelikeness, leavened with greater complexity than some of the other, more static characters. Her relationship with her father is more like that of a mother and son, as she consistently dotes upon him, calling him her cherub. Her open and warm relationship with her father contrasts with her strained and resentful relationships with her mother and sister. Nicodemus Naughty Boffin, the Golden Dustman, becomes a member of the nouveau riches when old Mr. Harmon's heir is considered dead. He is illiterate, but wants to fit the image of a wealthy man, and so hires Silas Wegg to read to him in hopes of gaining more intelligence and worldliness. He is nearly blackmailed by Wegg. He assumes the role of a miser to show Bella the dangers of wealth, but eventually admits this behavior was an act and gives his money to Bella and John. Boffin's innocence, naive curiosity, and desire to learn in his new position in life contrast with his elaborate performances as Boffin the miser. One critics speculate that Dickens' decision to have Boffin playing a part may not have been planned, as it was not very convincing for a man who has shown his simplistic ignorance on several occasions. 2. Boffin's inheritance of old Harmon's money is appropriate because Harmon had attained it by combing the dust heaps, because this suggests social mobility. Boffin represents a wholesome contrast to such wealthy characters as the Veneerings and Podsnaps, and may have been based on Henry Dodd, a ploughboy who made his fortune removing London's rubbish. Mrs. Henrietta Boffin is Naughty Boffin's wife, and a very motherly woman, who convinces Mr. Boffin to take in an orphan boy called Johnny. This indicates another progressive development for Dickens as his female characters undertake a more active role in social reform. 13. Lizzie Hexam is a daughter of Gaffer Hexam and sister of Charlie Hexam. She is an affectionate daughter, but knows that Charlie must escape their living circumstances if he is to succeed in life, so she gives Charlie her money and helps him leave while their father is away. Later she is rejected by Charlie after she remains in poverty. Pursued romantically by both Bradley Headstone and Eugene Wrayburn, she fears Headstone's violent passion and yearns for Wrayburn's love, while acutely aware of the social gap between them. Lizzie saves Wrayburn from Headstone's attack and the two are married. She in effect acts as the moral center of the story and is by far the most wholly good character, almost bereft of ego. 1-1 Dickens carries over her moral superiority into her physical characterization. Her capacity for self-sacrifice is only slightly more credible than her gift for refined speech, 11 making her slightly unbelievable in comparison to her uneducated father and Jenny Wren. Lizzie's concern about social class reveals her reasoning for ensuring her brother's escape from poverty and ignorance, though she remains humble about her own situation. However, her moral character attracts Rayburn, her inherent goodness is rewarded with marital happiness. Charlie Hexam is the son of Jessie, Gaffer, Hexam and a brother of Lizzie. Originally a very caring brother, this changes as he rises above Lizzie in class and must remove himself from her to maintain his social standing. He was born into poverty, but receives schooling and becomes a teacher under Headstone's mentoring. Dickens uses him to critique both the schooling available to the poor, which was often overcrowded and noisy, 14, as well as the snobbish tendencies of those who managed to rise in status. Hexam is presented as morally corrupt, 13, because of how he distances himself from his past, and from his loving sister, in the name of his own upward movement. Mortimer Lightwood is a lawyer, who is an acquaintance of the Veneerings and a friend of Eugene Wrayburn. Lightwood acts as the storyteller, and it is through him that the reader and the other characters learn about Harmondsville. 1-1 However, under the mask of irony, 11 he assumes in telling his stories, he feels true friendship for Eugene, respect for Twemlow, and concern for the issues in which he is involved. In addition, he also serves as the commentator and a voice of conscience, 12 with sarcasm sometimes covering his concern. Through Lightwood's reason and advice, the reader is better able to judge the character's actions. Eugene Wrayburn, who is seen as the novel's second hero, is a barrister, and a gentleman by birth, though he is roguish and insolent. He is a close friend of Mortimer Lightwood, and involved in a love triangle with Lizzie Hexam and Bradley Headstone. Both these characters act as foils to Wrayburn. Lizzie contrasts with Eugene's more negative traits and Headstone makes Eugene appear more virtuous. He is nearly killed by Headstone but, like Harmon Rokesmith, reborn, after his incident in the river. 8 Though Wrayburn appears morally grey through most of the novel, by the end he is seen as a moral, sympathetic character and a true gentleman, after choosing to marry Lizzie in order to save her reputation, even though she is socially below him. 9. Jenny Wren, whose real name is Fanny Cleaver, is the doll's dressmaker, with whom Lizzie lives after her father dies. She is disabled with a bad back and limited leg mobility. She is very motherly towards her drunken father, whom she calls her bad child. 10. Jenny later cares for Eugene while he recovers from Headstone's attack on his life. She may have a romance with Sloppy at the end of the book, which the reader may surmise will end in marriage. Although her mannerisms give her a certain strangeness, 11. Jenny is very perceptive, identifying Eugene Wrayburn's intentions towards Lizzie in his small actions. Her role as a creator and a caretaker, and her pleasant fancies of flowers, bird song, numbers of blessed, white-clad children, 12 reflect the mind's ability to rise above adverse circumstances. Mr. Raya is a Jew who manages Mr. Fledgeby's money-lending business. He cares for and assists Lizzie Hexam and Jenny Wren when they have no one else. Some critics believe that Raya was meant by Dickens to act as an apology for his stereotyping of Fagin in Oliver Twist, and in particular a response to Mrs. Eliza Davis. She had written to Dickens complaining that the portrayal of Fagin did a great wrong to all Jews. However, some still take issue with Raya, asserting that he is too gentle to be a believable human being. 1-5. Bradley Headstone began life as a pauper 10 but rose to become Charlie Hexam's schoolmaster and the love interest of Miss Peacher. However, he ignores her and falls in love with Lizzie Hexam, whom he pursues passionately and violently, though his advances are rejected. He then develops an insane jealousy towards Eugene Wrayburn, whom he follows at night like an ill-tamed wild animal, 10 in hopes of catching him with Lizzie together. He disguises himself as Rogue Riderhood and almost succeeds in drowning Wrayburn. After Riderhood realizes that Headstone is impersonating him to incriminate him for Rayburn's murder, he attempts to blackmail Headstone, and this leads to a fight, and both men drowning in the river. Described repeatedly as decent and constrained, 10 Headstone's personality splits between painfully respectable, 16, and wild jealousy, with a passion terrible in its violence. 1-7 He is presented by Dickens as an animal in the night and a respectable, mechanical, 11 schoolteacher during the day. A possible explanation for this dichotomy may be Headstone's intellectual insecurity, 17, that manifests itself in violence after Lizzie's rejection. The Most complex of Dickens's villain murderers are presented as such double figures. 1-6 Dickens here demonstrates the way identity can be manipulated. Headstone also serves as a foil to Rayburn, and his evil nature antagonizes Rayburn, as much as Lizzie's goodness helps him. Silas Wegg is ballad seller with a wooden leg. He is a social parasite, hired to read for the Boffins and teach Mr. Boffin how to read, despite not being entirely literate himself. Wegg finds Harmon's will in the dust heaps, and he and Venus attempt to use it to blackmail the Boffins. He wishes to buy back his own leg as soon as he has the money, which is an attempt to complete himself. 8 Wegg claims to want the leg so that he can be seen as respectable. Some critics find the juxtaposition of Wegg's villainy and his sense of humor to be inconsistent. Mr. Venus, a taxidermist and articulator of bones, who is in love with Pleasant Riderhood, whom he eventually marries. He meets Silas Wegg after having procured his amputated leg, and he pretends to join Silas in blackmailing Mr. Boffin regarding Harmon's will, while really informing Boffin of Silas's scheme. Dickens is said to have based Mr. Venus on a real taxidermist named J. Willis, although Venus's defining obsession renders him among Dickens's most outlandish, least realistic characters. 1-1. Mr. Alfred Lamley is married to Sophronia Lamley. Both of them, at the time of their marriage, were under the false impression that the other was fairly wealthy. Subsequently, they are forced to use their overabundance of charm and superficiality in attempts to make influential acquaintances and gain money through them. Mrs. Sophronia Lamley is described, early in the novel, as the mature young lady, and a proper young woman. However, this turns out to be ironic, as she is later shown to be greedy, cold, and manipulative. She married Alfred Lamley because she believed he had money, and when it turned out he did not, the two of them formed a partnership that involves swindling money from others. They, for example, conspire to trap Georgiana Podsnap in a marriage with Fledgeby, though Sophronia repents before this plan can come to fruition, and arranges for Twemlow to inform the Podsnaps without her husband's knowledge. Georgiana Podsnap, a daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Podsnap, who is very sheltered, shy, trusting and naive. Because of this, she is taken advantage of by more manipulative upper-class characters, such as Fledgeby and the Lamleys, who scheme to befriend her and take her money. She is courted by Fledgeby, through Alfred Lamley, although not with honorable intentions, and nearly finds herself trapped in a marriage with Fledgeby until Sophronia Lamley suffers a change of heart. Mr. Fledgeby fascination. Fledgeby is a friend of the Lamleys. He owns Mr. Rya's moneylending business, is greedy and corrupt, and makes his money through speculation. He provides a contrast with Mr. Rya's gentleness, and underlines the point that a Jew may be kindly and a Christian cruel. 1-8 Fledgeby nearly marries Georgiana Podsnap to gain access to her money, but Sophronia Lamley backs out of the scheme, and once Fledgeby is no longer allied with the Lamleys, they seek him out and beat him. Roger, Rogue, Riderhood, Gaffer, Hexam's partner until Gaffer rejects him when he is convicted of theft. In revenge for that slight, he falsely turns Gaffer in as the murderer of John Harmon, in the hope of receiving a reward. Later, Riderhood becomes a lock-keeper, and Headstone attempts to frame him for the murder of Eugene Rayburn. After attempts to blackmail Headstone, the two men fall in the River Thames during a fight and both drown. In his, literally irredeemable villainy, 11 Riderhood represents an opportunistic character who will change his behavior according to whatever suits his needs best at any given moment. Reginald, Rum Tea, Wilfer is Bella Wilfer's doting father, who is gentle, innocent, fatherly, and kindly, despite his querulous wife and daughter and thankless work as a clerk. Dickens describes him in almost childish terms, and he is often called the cherub. Minor characters. Edit. Mr. Inspector, a police officer, who acts as a witness to several important events, such as when the corpse from the river is mistakenly identified as John Harmon, when Gaffer Hexam is taken into custody, and when the real John Harmon is named. 1-2 In general, he is imperturbable, omnicompetent, firm but genial, and an accomplished actor. 16 Who commands authority. However, he is not particularly effective in his administration of the law, and this leads to doubt about the justice system in the novel. Mr. John Podsnap, a pompous man of the upper middle class, married to Mrs. Podsnap and the father of Georgiana, who is smug and jingoistic. Some critics believe that Dickens used Podsnap to satirize John Forster, Dickens's lifelong friend and official biographer. However, Dickens insisted he only used some of Forster's mannerisms for this character, who was in no way to represent his closest friend. Forster, like Dickens, rose with difficulty from an impoverished middle-class background. 19. The character of Podsnap was used to represent the views of society, as shown in his disapproval of Lizzie Hexam and Eugene Raeburn's marriage. 9. Mrs. Podsnap, the mother of Georgiana Podsnap. Though she embodies the materialistic ideals of her husband and daughter, Mrs. Podsnap is the least prominent of the family. She is described as a fine woman, 10, in her embodiment of the typical upper-class wife. Mrs. Wilfer, Bella's mother, a woman who is never satisfied with what she has. Her haughtiness is apparent in the way she acts at the Boffins' home and when Bella and Rokesmith return after their wedding. Her animosity towards her husband, her greed and discontent contrast with her husband's good nature and provide an image of what Bella could become, should she not change. Lavinia Wilfer, Bella's younger sister and George Sampson's fiancée. Vocal and opinionated, she is the only character who will stand up to Mrs. Wilfer by matching her derisiveness and audacity. In some ways, she acts as a foil to Bella, and while Bella overcomes her desire for money and appreciates other aspects of life, Lavinia remains resentful in her poverty. George Sampson, Lavinia Wilfer's suitor, who was originally in love with Bella. He provides comic relief and a contrast with the idyllic relationship between Bella and Rokesmith Harmon. Mr. Melvin Twemlow, the well-connected friend of the Veneerings, who is often cultivated for his supposed influence with powerful people, such as Lord Snigsworth. Mrs. Lamley tells him about their plot to marry Georgiana Podsnap and Fledgeby, to whom Twemlow owes money. Though Twemlow is introduced as being as insensible as a table at the Veneerings' dinner party, he comes to reflect a wise way of thinking. His wearing of a collar and cravat creates picturesque and archaic impression. 11. And he proves himself a true gentleman in his response to Raeburn's marriage. 1. Mrs. Betty Higden, a child-minder, who takes in poor children and cares for them, including Johnny, the orphan whom the Boffins plan to adopt before he dies in the children's hospital. She is old and poor, and portrayed sympathetically as pitiable. She is so terrified of dying in the workhouse that, when she begins to grow sick, she runs away to the country and ends up dying in Lizzie Hexam's arms. Mrs. Higden draws readers' attention to the miserable lives led by the poor, and the need for social reform. Johnny, the orphan great-grandson of Betty Higden. The Boffins plan on adopting Johnny, but he dies in the children's hospital before they are able to do so. Sloppy, a foundling who assists Betty Higden in taking care of children. Raised in the workhouse, he has a learning disability, but is nevertheless adept at reading the newspaper for Mrs. Higden. He is portrayed as inherently innocent because of his disability, and carts away Weg at the end of the novel. Jesse, Gaffer, Hexam, a waterman and the father of Lizzie and Charlie, who makes a living by robbing corpses found in the River Thames. His former partner, Rogue Riderhood, turns him in for the murder of John Harmon after Harmon's body is supposedly dragged from the river. A search is mounted to find and arrest Gaffer, but he is discovered dead in his boat. Gaffer's opposition to education prompts Lizzie to sneak Charlie away to school, though she stays with her father. As a result, Gaffer disowns Charlie as a son. In a sense, Gaffer predicted the alienating effect education would have on Charlie. Pleasant Riderhood, the daughter of Rogue Riderhood, who works in a pawn shop, and, like Jenny Wren and Lizzie Hexam, is another daughter caring for her abusive father as though he were her child, and who, in vain, tries to steer him along the path of right. 2021, she eventually marries Mr. Venus. Mr. and Mrs. Veneering, a nouveau riche husband and wife whose main preoccupation is to advance in the social world. They invite influential people to their dinner parties where their furniture gleams with a sheen that they also put on to make themselves seem more impressive. They wear their acquaintances, their possessions, and their wealth like jewelry, in an attempt to impress those around them. Veneering eventually goes bankrupt and they retire to France to live on the jewels he bought for his wife. Miss Abby Potterson, mistress of the 6 Jolly Fellowship quarters, she keeps the inn respectable, and only allows patrons to drink as much as she sees fit. She is likened, humorously, to a schoolmistress, linking her to the novel's concern with education. 2. Miss Peacher, a school teacher who is in love with Bradley Headstone. She is a good and harmless character, though she displays an addiction to rules and forms. 1. In addition, she shows a naive confidence in the outward appearance of things. 11. As demonstrated by her love of Headstone, a villain who gives the impression of being good. Mr. Dahl's Jenny Wren's alcoholic father. Jenny calls him her bad child, and treats him accordingly. 2021, his real name is not known to Eugene, so Eugene calls him Mr. Dahls. As his daughter is really named Fanny Cleaver, His name might be Mr. Cleaver, but he is never called by a name other than, "my bad child," or, "Mr. Dolls," in the novel. George Radfoot III mate on the ship bringing John Harmon back to England, whose dead body, found in the river by Gaffer Hexam, is identified as being Harmon because of the papers found in his pockets. He had been involved in crimes and schemes with Riderhood, who most likely was responsible for trying to kill Harmon and killing Radfoot. Plot summary. Edit. Having made his fortune from London's rubbish, a rich misanthropic miser dies, estranged from all except his faithful employees Mr. and Mrs. Boffin. By his will, his fortune goes to his estranged son John Harmon, who is to return from his home abroad possibly in South Africa, to claim it, on condition that he marries a woman he has never met, Miss Bella Wilfer. The implementation of the will is in the charge of the solicitor, Mortimer Lightwood, who has no other practice. The son and heir does not appear, though some knew him aboard the ship. To London. A body is found in the Thames by Gaffer Hexam, rowed by his daughter Lizzie. He is a waterman who makes his living by retrieving corpses and taking the cash in their pockets, before handing them over to the authorities. Papers in the pockets of the drowned man identify him as Harmon. Present at the identification of the water-soaked corpse is a mysterious young man, who gives his name as Julius Hanford and then disappears. The elder Harmon's estate devolves upon Mr. and Mrs. Boffin, naive and good-hearted people who wish to enjoy it for themselves and to share it with others. The childless couple take pity on Miss Bella Wilfer, whose fortunes are thought to have been lost with the death of John Harmon, and take her into their household, and treat her as their pampered child and heiress. Bella is disgusted by her lower middle-class upbringing, and obsessed with marrying a wealthy man. They also accept an offer from Julius Hanford, now going under the name of John Rokesmith, to serve as their confidential secretary and man of business, at no salary for a trial period of 2 years. Rokesmith uses this position to watch and learn everything about the Boffins, Miss Wilfer, and the aftershock of the drowning of Harmon. Mr. Boffin engages a one-legged ballad seller, Silas Wegg, to read aloud to him in the evenings, and Wegg tries to take advantage of his position and of Mr. Boffin's good heart to obtain other advantages from the wealthy dustman. When the Boffins purchase a large home, Wegg is invited to live in the old Harmon home. Wegg hopes to find hidden treasure in the house or in the mounds of trash on the property. Gaffer Hexam, who found the body, is accused of murdering Harmon by a fellow waterman, Roger, rogue, Riderhood, who is bitter at having been cast off as Hexam's partner, and who covets the large reward offered in relation to the murder. As a result of the accusation, Hexam is shunned by his fellows on the river, and excluded from the 6 Jolly Fellowship quarters. The public house they frequent. Hexam's young son, the clever but priggish Charlie Hexam, leaves his father's house to better himself at school, and to train to be a schoolmaster, encouraged by his sister, the beautiful Lizzie Hexam. Lizzie stays with her father, to whom she is devoted. Before Riderhood can claim the reward for his false allegation, Hexam is found drowned himself. Lizzie Hexam becomes the lodger of a doll's dressmaker, a disabled teenager nicknamed Jenny Wren. Jenny's alcoholic father lives with them, and is treated by Jenny as a child. A subplot involves the activities of the devious Mr. and Mrs. Lamley, a couple who have married each other for money, only to discover that neither has any. They attempt to obtain financial advantage by pairing off Fledgeby to the naive heiress Georgiana Podsnap. Fledgeby is an extortioner and money lender, who uses the kindly old Jew Raya as his cover, temporarily causing Raya to fall out with his friend and protégé Jenny Wren. The work-shy barrister Eugene Rayburn notices Lizzie when accompanying his friend and business partner Mortimer Lightwood to Gaffer Hexam's home and falls in love with her. However, he soon gains a violent rival in Bradley Headstone, Charlie Hexam's schoolmaster. Charlie wants his sister to be under obligation to no one but him, and tries to arrange lessons for her with Headstone, only to find that Rayburn has already engaged a teacher for both Lizzie and Jenny. Headstone quickly develops an unreasonable passion for Lizzie, and makes an unsuccessful proposal, which Lizzie firmly but kindly refuses. Angered by being refused, and by Rayburn's dismissive attitude towards him, Headstone comes to see Rayburn as the source of all his misfortunes, and takes to following him around the streets of London at night. Lizzie fears Headstone's threats to Rayburn, and is unsure of Rayburn's intentions toward her. Rayburn admits to Lightwood that he does not know his own intentions yet, either. She flees both men, getting work upriver from London, with the help of Mr. Raya. Mr. and Mrs. Boffin attempt to adopt a young orphan, in the care of his great-grandmother, Betty Higden, but the boy dies. Mrs. Higden minds children for a living, assisted by a foundling known as Sloppy. When Lizzie Hexam finds Mrs. Higden dying and stops to care for her, She meets the Boffins and Bella Wilfer. Rokesmith is in love with Bella Wilfer, but she cannot bear to accept him, having insisted that she will marry only for money. Mr. Boffin appears to be corrupted by his wealth, and obsessed with biographies of misers. He begins to treat Rokesmith with contempt, stinginess, and cruelty. This arouses Bella Wilfer's sympathy, and when the Lamleys, hoping to take Bella and Rokesmith's place as Mr. Boffin's favorites, reveal to Mr. Boffin that Rokesmith has proposed to Bella, and he dismisses Rokesmith, Bella stands up for him. Rokesmith and Bella marry and live happily, though in relatively poor circumstances. Bella soon conceives. In the meantime, Rayburn has obtained information about Lizzie's whereabouts from Jenny's father, and finds the object of his affections. Headstone engages with Riderhood, now working as a lock-keeper, as Headstone is consumed with executing his threats against Rayburn. After following Rayburn upriver and seeing him with Lizzie, Headstone attacks Rayburn and leaves him for dead. Headstone tries to place blame for the assault on rogue Riderhood by dressing in similar clothes when doing the deed and throwing his own clothes in the river. Riderhood fetches the bundle of clothing. Lizzie finds Rayburn in the river and rescues him, with Jenny's help, who has discovered Fledgeby's trick, and reconciled with Mr. Raya. Rayburn, on his deathbed, marries Lizzie, and suppresses any hint that Headstone was his attacker to save her reputation. When he survives, he is glad that his near-death experience brought him into a loving marriage. Although her social inferiority had not bothered him, he believes Lizzie would not otherwise have married him due to the social gulf between them. Headstone learns Rayburn is alive, recovering from the brutal beating, and married to Lizzie. He is overcome with the hopelessness of his situation. Riderhood attempts to blackmail Headstone. Confronted by Riderhood in his classroom, Headstone is seized with a self-destructive urge and flings himself into the lock, pulling Riderhood with him. Both drown. Meanwhile, Silas Wegg has, with help from Mr. Venus, an articulator of bones, searched the dust mounds and discovered a later will of the elder Harmon, which bequeaths his estate to the crown rather than the Boffins. Wegg decides to blackmail Boffin, but Venus has second thoughts and reveals the plot to Boffin. It gradually becomes clear to the reader that John Rokesmith is in fact John Harmon. Harmon had switched clothes with his shipmate en route to London, because Harmon wanted an opportunity to learn about his betrothed before claiming his inheritance. The shipmate agreed, with the intention of stealing Harmon's money. However, Riderhood had drugged, robbed, and dumped both Harmon and his shipmate in the river. Harmon survived the attempted murder, and maintained his alias to try to win Bella Wilfer for himself, rather than his inheritance. Now that she has married him, believing him to be poor, he throws off his disguise. It is revealed that Mr. Boffin's apparent miserliness and ill treatment of his secretary were part of a scheme to test Bella's motives. When Wegg attempts to clinch his blackmail on the basis of the later will, Boffin turns the tables by revealing a still later will by which the fortune is granted to Boffin even at young John Harmon's expense. The Boffins are determined to make the Harmons their heirs anyway, so all ends well, except for Wegg, who is carted away by Sloppy. Sloppy himself becomes friendly with Jenny Wren, whose father has died. Water imagery. Edit. A major symbol is the River Thames, which is linked to the major theme of rebirth and renewal. Water is seen as a sign of new life, and associated with the Christian sacrament of baptism. Characters like John Harmon and Eugene Rayburn end up in the river, and come out reborn. Rayburn emerges from the river close to death, but is ready to marry Lizzie, and to avoid naming his attacker to save her reputation. He surprises everyone, including himself, when he survives and goes on to have a loving marriage with Lizzie. John Harmon also appears to end up in the river through no fault of his own, and when Gaffer pulls a body dressed like Harmon out of the waters, Harmon adopts the alias of John Rokesmith. This alias is for his own safety and peace of mind. He wants to know that he can do things on his own, and does not need his father's name or money to make a good life for himself. 3-4. Dickens uses many images that relate to water. Phrases such as the depths and shallows of Podsnappery, 10, and the time had come for flushing and flourishing this man down for good, 10, are examples of such imagery. Some critics see this as being used excessively. 4-5. Themes. Edit. Aside from examining the novel's form and characters, modern critics of Our Mutual Friend have focused on identifying and analyzing what they perceive as the main themes of the novel. Although Stanley Friedman's 1973 essay, The Motif of Reading in Our Mutual Friend, emphasizes references to literacy and illiteracy in the novel, Friedman states, money, the dust heaps, and the river have been seen as the main symbols, features, that help develop such themes as avarice, predation, death and rebirth, the quest for identity and pride. To these images and ideas, we may add what Monroe Engel calls the social themes of Our Mutual Friend, having to do with money dust, and relatedly with the treatment of the poor, education, representative government, even the inheritance laws. 4.6. According to Metz, many of the prominent themes in Dickens's earlier works of fiction are intricately woven into Dickens's last novel. She states, like David Copperfield, Our Mutual Friend is about the relationship between work and the realization of self, about the necessity to be useful before one can be happy. Like Great Expectations, it is about the power of money to corrupt those who place their faith in its absolute value. Like Bleak House, it is about the legal, bureaucratic, and social barriers that intervene between individuals and their nearest neighbors. Like all of Dickens's novels, and especially the later ones, it is about pervasive social problems, poverty, disease, class bitterness, the sheer ugliness and vacuity of contemporary life. Contemporary critics of Dickens. Edit. At the time of its original serial publication, Our Mutual Friend was not regarded as one of Dickens's greatest successes, and on average fewer than 30,000 copies of each installment was sold. 4.8 Though the New York Times, of the 22nd of November 1865, conjectured, by most readers, the last work by Dickens will be considered his best, 2. Direct evidence of how readers responded to Dickens's novels is scarce. Because Dickens burned his letters, the voices of his 19th-century serial audiences remain elusive. 49 Thus, evidence of the reactions of his Victorian-era readers must be obtained from reviews of Our Mutual Friend by Dickens's contemporaries. The first British periodical to print a review of Our Mutual Friend, published 30 April 1864 in the London Review, extolled the first serial installment, stating, "Few literary pleasures are greater than that which we derive from opening the first number of one of Mr. Dickens's stories, 50, and Our Mutual Friend opens well." 51. In 1866 George Stott found the novel flawed. Mr. Dickens must stand or fall by the severest canons of literary criticism. It would be an insult to his acknowledged rank to apply a more lenient standard, and bad art is not the less bad art and a failure because associated, as it is in his case, with much that is excellent, and not a little that is even fascinating. Dickens had his fans and detractors just like every author throughout the ages, but not even his most strident supporters like E.S. Dallas felt that Our Mutual Friend was perfect. Rather, the oft-acknowledged genius of Dickens seems to have overshadowed all reviews and made it impossible for most critics to completely condemn the work, the majority of these reviews being a mixture of praise and disparagement. In November 1865 E.S. Dallas, in the Times, lauded Our Mutual Friend as one of the best of even Dickens's tales, 52, but was unable to ignore the flaws. This last novel of Mr. Charles Dickens, really one of his finest works, and one in which on occasion he even surpasses himself, labors under the disadvantage of a beginning that drags. On the whole, however, at that early stage the reader was more perplexed than pleased. There was an appearance of great effort without corresponding result. We were introduced to a set of people in whom it is impossible to take an interest, and were made familiar with transactions that suggested horror. The great master of fiction exhibited all his skill, performed the most wonderful feats of language, loaded his page with wit and many a fine touch peculiar to himself. The agility of his pen was amazing, but still at first we were not much amused. 5.3 Despite the mixed review, it pleased Dickens so well that he gave Dallas the manuscript. Plot. Edit. Many critics found fault with the plot, and in 1865, the New York Times described it as an involved plot combined with an entire absence of the skill to manage and unfold it. 2. In the London Review, in the same year, an anonymous critic felt that the whole plot in which the deceased Harmon, Boffin, Wegg, and John Rokesmith are concerned is wild and fantastic, wanting in reality, and leading to a degree of confusion which is not compensated by any additional interest in the story. 54. And he also found that the final explanation is a disappointment. 5.4 However, the London Review also thought that the mental state of a man about to commit the greatest of crimes has seldom been depicted with such elaboration and apparent truthfulness. 55. Characters. Edit. Many reviewers responded negatively to the characters in Our Mutual Friend. The 1865 review by Henry James in The Nation described every character as a mere bundle of eccentricities, animated by no principle of nature whatever. 56 And condemned Dickens for a lack of characters who represent sound humanity. 5-6 James maintained that none of the characters add anything to the reader's understanding of human nature, and asserted that the characters in Our Mutual Friend were grotesque creatures, 56 who did not represent actual existing Victorian types. Like James, the 1869 article, Table Talk, in Once a Week did not view the characters in Our Mutual Friend as realistic. The article asks, do men live by finding the bodies of the drowned, and landing them ashore, with their pockets loose inside out, for the sake of the reward offered for their recovery? As far as we can make out, no. We have been at some trouble to inquire from men who should know, watermen, who have lived on the River Nile all their lives, if they have seen late at night a dark boat with a solitary occupant, drifting down the river on the lookout, plying his frightful trade. The answer has uniformly been, no, we have never seen such men, and more, they do not believe in their existence. 5-7. The reviewer in the London Review in 1865 denounced the characters of Weg and Venus, who appear to us in all the highest degree unnatural, the one being a mere phantasm, and the other a nonentity. 5-8 However, he applauded the creation of Bella Wilfer. Probably the greatest favorite in the book will be, or rather is already, Bella Wilfer. She is evidently a pet of the author's, and she will long remain the darling of half the households of England and America. 5-9 E. S. Dallas, in his 1865 review, concurred that, Mr. Dickens has never done anything in the portraiture of women so pretty and so perfect, 60, as Bella. Dallas also admired the creation of Jenny Wren, who was greeted with contempt by Henry James, stating that, The Doll's Dressmaker is one of his most charming pictures, and Mr. Dickens tells her strange story with a mixture of humor and pathos which it is impossible to resist. 6-1. In an 1867 Atlantic Monthly article entitled, The Genius of Dickens, critic Edwin Percy Whipple declared that Dickens's characters have a strange attraction to the mind, and are objects of love or hatred, like actual men and women. 62. Pathos and Sentiment. Edit. In October 1865 an unsigned review appeared in the London Review stating that, Mr. Dickens stands in need of no allowance on the score of having outridden himself. His fancy, his pathos, his humor, his wonderful powers of observation, his picturesqueness, and his versatility, are as remarkable now as they were 20 years ago. 6-3 But like other critics, after praising the book this same critic then turned around and disparaged it. Not that we mean to say Mr. Dickens has outgrown his faults. They are as obvious as ever, sometimes even trying our patience rather hard. A certain extravagance in particular scenes and persons, a tendency to caricature and grotesqueness, and a something here and there which savors of the melodramatic, as if the author had been considering how the thing would tell on the stage, are to be found in Our Mutual Friend, as in all this great novelist's productions. 5-8. Edwin Whipple in 1867 also commented on the sentiment and pathos of Dickens's characters, stating, but the poetical, the humorous, the tragic, or the pathetic element is never absent in Dickens's characterization, to make his delineations captivating to the heart and imagination, and give the reader a sense of having escaped from whatever in the actual world is dull and wearisome. 64. However, in 1869 George Stott condemned Dickens for being overly sentimental. Mr. Dickens's pathos we can only regard as a complete and absolute failure. It is unnatural and unlovely. He attempts to make a stilted phraseology, and weak and sickly sentimentality do duty for genuine emotion. 65 Still, in the manner of all the other mixed reviews, Stott states that, we still hold him to be emphatically a man of genius. 6-6. The Spectator in 1869 concurred with Stott's opinion, writing, Mr. Dickens has brought people to think that there is a sort of piety in being gushing and maudlin, and that his works are heavily imbued with the most mawkish and unreal sentimentalism. 67 But the unsigned critic still maintained that Dickens was one of the great authors of his time. 6-3. Later literary criticism. Edit. G. K. Chesterton, one of Dickens's critics in the early 20th century, expressed the opinion that Mr. Boffin's pretended fall into miserliness was originally intended by Dickens to be authentic, but that Dickens ran out of time and so took refuge in the awkward pretense that Boffin had been acting. Chesterton argues that while we might believe Boffin could be corrupted, we can hardly believe he could keep up such a strenuous pretense of corruption. Such a character as his, rough, simple and lumberingly unconscious, might be more easily conceived as really sinking in self-respect and honor than as keeping up, month after month, so strained and inhuman a theatrical performance. It might have taken years to turn naughty Boffin into a miser, but it would have taken centuries to turn him into an actor. 6-8 However, Chesterton also praised the book as being a return to Dickens's youthful optimism and creative exuberance, full of characters who have that great Dickens quality of being something which is pure farce and yet which is not superficial, an unfathomable farce, a farce that goes down to the roots of the universe. 6-8. In his 1940 article, Dickens, Two Scrooges, Edmund Wilson states, "Our Mutual Friend, like all these later books of Dickens, is more interesting to us today than it was to Dickens's public. Certainly the subtleties and profundities that are now discovered in it were not noticed by the reviewers." 369. As a whole, modern critics of Our Mutual Friend, particularly those of the last half-century, have been more appreciative of Dickens's last completed work than his contemporary reviewers. Although some modern critics find Dickens's characterization in Our Mutual Friend problematic, most tend to positively acknowledge the novel's complexity and appreciate its multiple plot lines. In November 2019, BBC Arts included Our Mutual Friend on its list of the 100 most influential novels. 7-0. Form and plot. Edit. In his 2006 article, The Richness of Redundancy, Our Mutual Friend, John R. Reed states, "Our Mutual Friend has not pleased many otherwise satisfied readers of Dickens's fiction. For his contemporaries and such acute assessors of fiction as Henry James, the novel seemed lack structure, among other faults. More recently, critics have discovered ways in which Dickens can be seen experimenting in the novel." 4. Reed maintains that Dickens's establishment of an incredibly elaborate structure for Our Mutual Friend was an extension of Dickens's quarrel with realism. In creating a highly formal structure for his novel, which called attention to the novel's own language, Dickens embraced taboos of realism. Reed also argues that Dickens's employment of his characteristic technique of offering his reader what might be seen as a surplus of information within the novel, in the form of a pattern of references, exists as a way for Dickens to guarantee that the meaning of his novel might be transmitted to his reader. Reed cites Dickens's multiple descriptions of the River Thames and repetitive likening of Gaffer to a roused bird of prey in the novel's first chapter as evidence of Dickens's use of redundancy to establish two of the novel's fundamental themes, preying, scavenging, and the transformative powers of water. According to Reed, to notice and interpret the clues representing the novel's central themes that Dickens gives his reader, the reader must have a surplus of these clues. Echoing Reed's sentiments, in her 1979 article, The Artistic Reclamation of Waste in Our Mutual Friend, Nancy Aycock-Metz claims, the reader is thrown back upon his own resources. He must suffer, along with the characters of the novel, from the climate of chaos and confusion, and like them, he must begin to make connections and impose order on the details he observes. 4-7. In his 1995 article, The Cup and the Lip and the Riddle of Our Mutual Friend, Greg A. Hesimovich reaffirms Metz's notion of reading the novel as a process of connection and focuses on what he sees as one of the main aspects of Dickens's narrative, a complex working out of the mysteries and idiosyncrasies presented in the novel. 5. Unlike Dickens's contemporary critics, Hesimovich commends Dickens for Our Mutual Friend's disjunctive, riddle-like structure and manipulation of plots, declaring, in a tale about conundrums and questions of identity, divergence of plots is desirable. 7-1. Hesimovich goes on to say that in structuring his last novel as a riddle game, Dickens challenges conventions of 19th-century Victorian England and that the sickness infecting Dickens's composition of Our Mutual Friend is that of Victorian society generally, not Dickens himself. Characters. Edit. Harland S. Nelson's 1973 article, Dickens's Our Mutual Friend and Henry Mayhew's London Labour and the London Poor, examines Dickens's inspiration for two of the novel's working-class characters. Nelson asserts that Gaffer Hexam and Betty Higden were potentially modeled after real members of London's working class whom Mayhew interviewed in the 1840s for his non-fiction work London Labour and the London Poor. Unlike some of Dickens's contemporaries, who regarded the characters in Our Mutual Friend as unrealistic representations of actual Victorian people, Nelson maintains that London's 19th-century working class is authentically depicted through characters such as Gaffer Hexam and Betty Higden. 6. While novelist Henry James dismissed the minor characters Jenny Wren, Mr. Wegg, and Mr. Venus as pathetic characters, in his 1865 review of the novel, Greg Hesimovich in 1989 refers to them as important riddlers and riddlies. 7-2. Hesimovich suggests that, through the example of his minor characters, Dickens directs his readers to seek, with the chief characters, order and structure out of the apparent disjunctive, rubbish, in the novel, to analyze and articulate what ails a fallen London. Only then can the reader, mimicking the action of certain characters, create something harmonious and beautiful out of the fractured wasteland. 7. Some modern critics of Our Mutual Friend have been overall more critical of the novel's characters. In her 1970 essay, Our Mutual Friend, Dickens is the complete angler, Annabel Patterson declares, Our Mutual Friend is not a book which satisfies all of Dickens's admirers. Those who appreciate Dickens mainly for the exuberance of his characterization and his gift for caricature feel a certain flatness in this last novel. 7-3 Deirdre David claims that Our Mutual Friend is a novel through which Dickens, engaged in a fictive improvement of society, 74 that bore little relation to reality, especially regarding the character of Lizzie Hexam, whom David describes as a myth of purity among the desperate lower classes. David criticizes Dickens for his fable of regenerated bourgeois culture, and maintains that the character Eugene Rayburn's realistic counterpart would have been far more likely to offer Lizzie money for sex than to offer her money for education. 7-5